Hello and welcome to the Midnight Bible Study. Tonight's topic has to do with the authenticity of the New Testament. Is it historically reliable? Because there are those who call it into question. And so we need to look at, well, is it historically reliable? Now, historians use three tests to determine the reliability of ancient manuscripts. Now, the first one that they use is called the bibliographic test. And it's an examination of the textual transmission by which these documents reach us. So, meaning, let's look at how reliable are the copies that we have. So, how do we do this? We look at how many ancient copies do we have? And then, what's the time interval between the original text and the surviving texts? And by doing that, we can determine historical reliability. Now, as I mentioned, there are some who call into question the reliability of the New Testament, and most likely they haven't looked at the bibliographic test, because if they did, they would have hardly any way to back that up. Because what they don't seem to realize is there's only over 24,000 manuscript copies of portions of the New Testament. 24,000. In fact, you can't find any other document in history with that kind of reliability, with that kind of authentication. None of the ancient documents come close to that, not even close. So these 24,000 copies, ancient copies of our contemporary Bible, are dated between the 2nd century and the 15th century. Therefore, the entire Bible could be reconstructed word by word, letter by letter, syllable by syllable through these documents. Everything can be verified, and the difference between them is entirely negligible, literally down to maybe a comma here or something like that. There's no doctrinal issues that are disputed whatsoever, because, well, let me give you a sense of this. According to biblioapologetics.org, when we consider the number of extant manuscripts of the New Testament that are in existence today, the numbers are almost too incredible to imagine. Scholars today possess almost 6,000 ancient Greek New Testament copies and another 18,500 manuscripts of the New Testament translated into other languages. That totals 24,500 copies of the New Testament, and all of them essentially agree. And the time gap from the original manuscript to the earliest existent copies is only about 50 to 100 years. Now, according to Christian theologian Bernard Rahm, these scribes who put together these documents were not these ancient manuscripts who wrote them. These scribes were not ordinary copyists. Whether they copied Old or New Testament documents, and this is a quote, Jews preserved it so no other manuscript has ever been preserved. Jews preserved it as no other manuscript has ever been preserved. In other words, no other manuscript in history has ever been preserved with a greater accuracy than the New Testament. And Rahm goes on, with their Masorah counting methods, they kept tabs on every letter, every syllable, every word, every paragraph. They had special classes of men within their culture whose sole duty was to preserve and transmit these documents with practically perfect fidelity. Scribes, lawyers, Masoretes, whoever counted the letters and the syllables and the words. Oh yeah, well, that's a question. Whoever did this for Plato or Aristotle or Cicero and Seneca? I think we know the answer to that. Nobody did. And if they did, we don't know about it. based on this test, if you discount the Bible and you say, oh, the Bible is not accurate, well, based on the bibliographic test, if you discount the Bible, you literally would have to discount all of ancient literature, because none of it even comes close to the Bible in terms of authentication. So here's just a few examples. The history of Thucydides is known from less than a dozen manuscripts. It's known from 8 manuscripts, the earliest being recorded AD 900, after death 900. That's a 500-year gap. Now, the history of Herodotus is the same. The histories of Tacitus, less than a dozen ancient manuscripts survive. Less than a dozen. Comparing that to the New Testament, we're talking 24,000. So the highly credible and never questioned histories of Tacitus has half a dozen ancient manuscripts survive. They are dated from 800 to 1,000 years after the original, whereas the Bible, that's down to 50 to 100 years. Now, nobody would argue that these historic documents, that these histories by Theoclides and Tacitus, no one would argue that they are not authentic just because the earliest known copies are dated 1,300 years after the original. Nobody complains about them or questions their authenticity. Now, in contrast, the Codex Vaticanus, and what is that? It belongs to the Vatican Library. Arguably one of the most important translations of the Bible, one of the oldest. This book is supposedly written in the 4th century AD, contains most of the books of the Greek Bible with few exceptions. This was written only a couple hundred years after the death of Jesus, comparing that to these other great histories, which, like Tacitus, is 800 to 1,000 years after the original. So the abundance of copies makes it possible to verify the entire Bible as being totally accurate. It has not been corrupted by editors, despite what some conspiracy theorists have claimed. The differences are entirely negligible, down to like a comma or something. No fundamental doctrine of the Christian faith rests on any disputed passage. So there you go. Is the New Testament historically reliable? You can bank on it that it's entirely reliable. And in fact, there is no book in history that is more reliable than the Bible. God bless you, and good night from the Midnight Bible Study.